We're going to be talking about the Chernobyl disaster today. This is the most famous nuclear disaster in history. That's because it was even worse than the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Um, for scale, Hiroshima used 46 kilograms of uranium, whereas in Chernobyl, 180 tons of reactor fluid spontaneously exploded, which shows you just to scale how bad the disaster really was. In fact, it deposited 400 times more radioactive material in the atmosphere. In essence, it was a Soviet power plant in Pripyat, Ukraine. It was based in the north of Ukraine, and around 10% of the country's power supply came from here. 6,000 people worked in this power plant every day, and their daily exposure to radiation was actually considered safe. Until 1986, one day, an explosion happened in one of the reactors. This released a massive radioactive cloud, which covered all of Europe and went as far as Canada. The accident took place because of two reasons. Number one, there was a flawed design in the reactor, and number two, the staff happened to be incompetent. The disaster resulted in major changes to nuclear energy regulation, and unfortunately, it set an overwhelmingly bad precedent for nuclear energy in general. Let's talk about the design of the reactor. As I discussed earlier, it was designed and constructed by the Soviet government in 1972. It featured 4 reactors, as you can see over here. There's Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, and Unit 4. There were 2 more that were being constructed, but they were canceled after the accident took place. Now, this reactor design works essentially like a giant steam engine. What happened here was uranium was used as a fuel, and it was superheated so that water that came in through here became steam up here, and it rotated giant turbines up here. And there were uranium pellets were used as a fuel that you can see in this diagram as red tubes here. They were held up by pressure tubes, and there was a control mechanism in place as well. This included using water as a coolant and using graphite rods. Yes. Now, unfortunately, this was a design flaw because graphite was highly reactive in heat. So instead of decelerating the rate of reaction, it ended up acting as a catalyst. Construction took place, like I said, in Pripyat, and it took place adjacent to an artificial body of water, which was used as a cooling pond. This was a very expensive project and has become more expensive still because there is a sarcophagus currently covering the reactor that exploded. Right now, there's a 30-kilometer radius around the power plant that is called the exclusion zone, Chernobyl exclusion zone. By law, it's mandated that people should not live here, but interestingly, 108 people actually live in this area. These people are called Samosli villagers. Now, what exactly happened that caused the great accident? Raiz will discuss this.
So I will be discussing about the failure that led to the explosion of reactor number 4 in Chernobyl. So I'll be discussing in detail about the safety test, the night shift crew, the drop in power, the kill switch, and the power surge and the control rod failure. So let's begin with the safety test. Slide next slide, please. So why was there a need for a safety test at all? Because the reactor number 4 went in. The reactor number 4 went in operation on December 20th of 1983. So the test actually took place 3 years later. So they tried conducting this test 3 times previously, and they failed all 3 times. So the test, which was conducted on 26th of April midnight, was actually the 4th attempt. So actually the test was supposed to be conducted on afternoon of 25th April 1986, and Anatoly Dyatlov was given the responsibility by Viktor Burkhanov and Fomin to conduct this test. But then the test was delayed by 10 hours as Kiev called and said that they could not offer any more further power reduction So they asked for the test to take place at midnight. Next slide. So there's a shift change at midnight, and the test takes place during midnight. So the night shift crew are not trained to conduct the safety test. So the technicians are already under pressure, and they are very scared, as Anatoly Dyatlov will be supervising the test. And Anatoly Dyatlov is known for his very undisciplined character. And the half of the crew is debriefed about the test only minutes before it began, and they weren't also debriefed properly. Anatoly Dyatlov just shouts orders at them and tells the operators and the technicians present there to do as he says. And the next slide. So in this is the stage 3. There's a power drop. So Leonid Toptunov, one of the technicians present in Chernobyl reactor number 4 that day, is asked to reduce the power from 1600 megawatts to 700 megawatts to reach the final stage in order to begin the test. As he's slowly reducing the power to 700 megawatts, Anatoly Dyatlov asks him to rush the process and bring the power down to 700 megawatts as quickly as possible. Now, as he brings the power down around 750 megawatts, the reactor is stalled, and there is a massive power drop, and the power drops below 200 megawatt and eventually reaches around 50 megawatts, 30 to 50 megawatts. Now Anatoly Dyatlov rushes back inside the control room and shouts at all the technicians present there for stalling his reactor. Now stage 4. Dyatlov, the safety test still continues at such low power levels. The safety test is supposed to begin at 700 megawatts, but then when they are tried to increase the power back to 700 megawatts from 50 megawatts, but then they could only reach a maximum of 200 megawatts. In order to increase the power level back to 700 megawatts, there are 211 control rods present in the reactor number 4 at Chernobyl. They remove 205 control rods out of 211 control rods. Only 6 remain inside the reactor. Now, after doing this, they began the test, and after they begin the test, the power level starts to rise rapidly, and there is as the power level starts to rise rapidly, the kill switch is activated. Now, what the kill switch does is that this kill switch button, or is it called the AZ5 button or the scram button? Once this button is pressed, all the control rods which were pulled back out of the reactor number 4 goes back inside all at once. So all 206 control rods which were pulled out will go back at the same time. Once all these control rods are moved back in, the control rods act as a brake. How brake acts to a car? It halts the reaction which takes place. So the control rods are made of boron, which is supposed to reduce the reactivity of the reaction. But instead of it reducing the reactivity of the reaction, it actually increases the reactivity of the reaction, as the control rods are fitted with graphite tips. Graphite now acts as a very good accelerator to this reaction, which in place actually, instead of stopping the reaction, it actually accelerates the reaction. Now, as a result, the power levels reach 33,000 megawatts, whereas the maximum capacity of reactor number 4 is only 3,200 megawatts. Once the power levels reach such high, the lid of the reactor is blown off, and the roof of reactor number 4 building is completely blown off, and there's a huge explosion. And now Faiz will continue.
The cause of failure. The explosion at reactor 4 mainly occurred due to the major design flaws of the reactor, and on top of that, a total ignorance towards the safety protocols by the higher ranking people in charge. To make things a bit clear, I will begin with how the reactor 4 worked and how it was different than the other reactors of that time. The fission reactors used in Chernobyl plant were called RBMK-1000 reactors made by the Soviets. During the fission reaction, a uranium-235 molecule is broken up to release energy by the collision with neutron. Mostly barium, krypton, and 3 neutrons are produced as the byproducts, but sometimes xenon-135 can be produced instead. Xenon-135 isotope is the strongest neutron absorber on planet, and it plays an important role in the accident, which I will soon come on to. The RBMK reactors use large graphite blocks and the water from the pumps as the moderators, and along with that there were 211 boron control rods. The moderators slow down the high-speed neutrons, therefore allowing the chain reaction to proceed, whereas the control rods are used to control the rate of fission chain reaction by slowing it down or, like in an emergency, stopping it. The heat produced by fission reaction causes water to boil and produce steam. This steam is used to run the turbines and produce the electricity. The biggest design flaw of the RBMK reactor was that it had a positive void coefficient. All the other reactors in the world have a negative void coefficient. A negative void coefficient basically means that when the water level in the core decreases, the power level would decrease. This is to keep the reactor more stable. But in positive void coefficient, when the water level in the reactor decreased, the power level would rise. This made the reactor unsafe as it could go out of control. So, what happened that night? That night, the crew were performing a safety test on the reactor. For that test, they had to lower the power level of the reactor. This was achieved by inserting in the control rods. But they lowered it way too much, the safety protocols allowed it to be. This was their first violation. At this low power level, the Xenon 135 kept building up in the reactor. As being a neutron absorber, the power in the reactor decreased further. So now they had to remove the control rods to increase the power back up. But the shift supervisor and deputy chief engineer Anatoly Dyatlov ordered to remove almost all of the control rods. This was not just a huge mistake, but a complete violation of the safety procedures. Now, there was nothing controlling the reaction. The next step of the test required to remove water from the reactor. Now, with water gone, the power went up. The remaining water boiled off, leaving no water inside the core. So now, here the positive void coefficient made things worse. It increased the power further as there was a very low water level in the reactor. The power inside the reactor kept on rising, and with this constant increase in power, a high steam pressure was building up inside. Then one of the workers did what he was trained to do. He pressed the shutdown button, commonly known as the AZ5 button. This basically causes all the control rods to enter the reactor core. Now here comes another design flaw of the reactor. The control rods were made of boron, a neutron absorber, but their tips were made of graphite. So when those tips entered the reactor, graphite as a moderator increased the reaction inside further, therefore causing the steam pressure to go sky high. And then, boom, the first explosion occurred, sending a 1,000-ton reactor lid in the air due to very high steam pressure. And 2 to 3 seconds later, a second explosion occurred inside the core, which many say occurred due to hydrogen catching fire. These explosions exposed the reactor core and resulted in large amounts of radioactive material to leak out into the air, hence resulting in one of the worst disasters of 20th century.
I will be talking about the repercussions of the Chernobyl disaster. High levels of radiation were released into the nearby countries of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and even parts of Europe for a period of 10 days. Mass evacuation had to be taken place to protect the civilians from the radiation, and despite this, 28 deaths were reported over the period of 1 month due to radiation exposure. As can be seen from the chart here, every year the radiation deaths and deaths caused by the Chernobyl explosion uh, are at a level higher than 150,000, ranging from 250,000 per year to 160,000 deaths per year in 2011. Right? High levels of radiation in the atmosphere cause a dramatic increase in thyroid cancer. As can be seen from this graph, there's an exponential and sharp rise in the cases of thyroid cancer in the year 1998 and forward, and that is formally linked to the radiation effects of Chernobyl from the World Health Organization. Mothers within the USSR, neighboring countries, and part of Europe were advised by doctors to abort their babies in fear of giving birth to children with disabilities or mutations. More than that, psychological effects were also prevalent and resulted in a rise of drinking, smoking, apathy, and suicide in the community that took the trauma from the Chernobyl explosion. Right? Surrounding natural bodies of water and forests were greatly affected with the radiation poisoning. Pastures became grounds of radioactive iodine deposition, and large-scale mutation took place in fauna of Chernobyl region. And cows that grazed on the pasture were eaten by the civilians, and that further led to thyroid cancer and many other diseases that are linked to radioactive iodine intake. Now we will be going over the lessons learned from the Chernobyl explosion. The disaster was a major learning point in engineering history for not only nuclear power but for any engineering aspect that we go over today. The lessons can be divided into three main categories: technical lessons, non-technical lessons, which are the procedural lessons, and the ethical lessons. Slide. Technical lessons learned. Priority needs to be given to safety and preservation of people, of the civilians, of the community, of the environment, rather than productivity. Productivity is good, but not at a cost of lives and health of the environment and people. That is what can be seen in the Chernobyl explosion. People were sacrificed, environment was sacrificed to increase productivity and feed the ambition of certain individuals in the system. Graphite tipped control rods are unsuitable for reactors, though they're cheaper. That's why they were chosen for Chernobyl. They were cheaper, and in order to reduce the cost, graphite was chosen. Now, they were badly used, that is there, but more suitable and better options are available today, including hard water and light water, which are better and less reactive than graphite. Pressure tubes should be used instead of pressure vessels to transport the radioactive material within the reactors. Slide. Procedure lessons learned. Faster, better evacuation plans are required. It is reported that more elderly deaths took place due to the poor evacuation process rather than the radiation effects. And from this, we can learn that evacuation plans need to be as solid as the prevention plans. Furthermore, national emergency plans should be available in case of man-made disasters. For not only nuclear disaster, but any kind of man-made disaster, there should be a national emergency plan for people to feel safe feel safe within their country. Doctors trained regarding uh, doctors trained regarding dealing with disasters and their psychological effects should be present when dealing with situations like Chernobyl or other large disasters. Sorry. Ethical lessons learned. We know that the government hid information and misinformed the people, and being a civilian, people were getting information from two different sides, from the scientists who were saying one thing and then the government was saying another. So there was that caused vast fear and mistrust within the community and caused panic. Effective communication would have dispelled fears and misinformation and helped keep peace within the community despite the explosion that took place. And that's why it said that public trust matters more than hiding and keeping them safe in ignorance. Effective communication would have helped. And blind ambition is a dangerous vice. That is said for the individuals within the system who were seeking promotion by working faster and compromising the safety measures, which led to an international level disaster. Now we will go to the changes that took place after the Chernobyl explosion.
Yeah, I'll be talking about the changes that happened after Chernobyl. Widespread criticism made changes necessary. Political, technological, medical, and ethical effects of the disaster made change inevitable. Here, as we see in Figure 10, the IAEA conference held in 1986 to discuss regulation and mitigation of the effects of the Chernobyl disaster. Slide. Right, the changes in technology and procedure. One, change in technology. After the great disaster occurred, people decided that several changes need to be made to Chernobyl, and serious decisions need to be taken. The first important change is that more absorbers were added to the reactor graphite. Graphite was the main component used because it is a neutron moderator, and by placing the rods in the correct position, it would control the neutron moderation very well without any issues. Second change is that control roads were increased to the system because these specific roads are mainly using nuclear reactors to control the rate of fission of uranium, which was high at Chernobyl. So they decided to increase the number of control roads, especially that they behave well when placed with graphite. Finally, third change is the increasing the fuel enrichment. Scientists decided to increase the fuel enrichment at Chernobyl because uranium had a very low concentration, so they decided to increase the concentration by fuel enrichment, which makes it fissionable in water, and so it becomes less in reaction and keeps producing the same results. To move on, the changes in procedures. After this disaster occurred, many new laws and measures were taken to make sure such disasters cannot take place again. The IAEA were given the responsibility to take care of the nuclear instruments. They have established a peer review system which countries can discuss with experts and take advice about the design, safety measures, emergency preparedness, and response. In 1988, the IAEA and the OECD created a bridge between Paris and Vienna and implemented the joint protocol, which says that there can be a conflict between the conventions and only one can apply for the nuclear incident. This protocol became effective in 1992. Mainly, I was discussing about the increased involvement of the IAEA, the new regulation for the nuclear plant safety. Slide. These are the references which were taken our PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.